Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today is the third part in the Waco, David Koresh, and Branch Davidians saga. And it is official, there will be one more part to this. There's just too much in this story and in this case to fit it into 3 parts if I wanted to give you all the details and be really specific about what happened and have a really open discussion about what happened. So we are going to have one more part, and then I have a lot of amazing videos lined up for you in December. Cases that are so interesting that I've never heard anybody cover, so I'm so excited about that. And remember, you can always send me your recommendations for cases to stephanieharlowe@gmail.com. Now, before we get into the video, I want to talk about our sponsor for this video, and sponsors to this channel are incredibly important because we often get demonetized due to the things we talk about. And our sponsor for this video is Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a new type of documentary streaming service with over 2,000 documentaries, many of them available in 4K for no additional charge. And they're adding more every week. And today I want to recommend to you a new documentary that I just saw pop up on there that I loved, and it's called The Parachute Murder Plot. The description says, on Easter Sunday of 2015, Victoria Cilliers jumped out of a plane at 4,000 feet. When her parachute failed to open, she plummeted and crashed to the ground. Incredibly, she survived, only to discover the shocking truth: her own husband was the culprit. I've never heard of this case before, so it was incredibly interesting to watch a 46-minute documentary based on this case, and I really enjoyed it. So I definitely think you guys would be interested, and I think you'd be interested in trying Magellan TV. It is one of the best documentary services I've ever used or ever seen. And if you go to the description box, you can click on the link and you can try Magellan TV for a month for free. You can cancel anytime after or before, but I don't think that you're going to want to. What makes Magellan TV a little bit different is that it was founded by filmmakers, and their team of producers and curators bring together premium content which dives deep into diverse subjects and interests. Some of the featured genres include history, science, space, and nature, and there's documentary movies, series, and exclusive playlists. You can watch these programs anytime, anywhere on your television, your laptop, or your mobile device, and it's compatible with Roku, Amazon Fire TV, Apple TV, Google Play, and iOS. As always, the documentaries are streamed without interruption, no ads, and like I said, many of them in 4K. So it's really awesome. Give it a try, let me know, and make sure you message me on Twitter or Instagram, or tell me in the comments what you've been watching on Magellan TV. Let's get into the video. So it's very snowy today. We've had a little bit of a winter storm overnight, so I have my snow day mug. And I also have a sweater here in case it gets cold, because I had to turn off the heat in the house because when the heat kicks on, it's too loud to record. And I'm just ready to kind of cuddle in this little cocoon when the snow is falling outside and tell you guys a really interesting, crazy, and in most cases very sad story about what happened to David Koresh and the Branch Davidians once the ATF was zeroed in on them. After Ruby Ridge, David Koresh wondered out loud if maybe this was what they'd been planning for all these years. And perhaps what happened to Randy Weaver and his family at Ruby Ridge was a dress rehearsal for a planned attack on Mount Carmel. Then he found out that the ATF and other law enforcement agencies had been in constant contact with Mark Bro, who was living in Australia at that time. The ATF had also gone to the Special Forces located at Mount Hood and asked for assistance in training their agents. But federal law states that the United States military can only help out these law enforcement agencies if there's drugs involved. So allegedly, the ATF lied to them and told them that the Branch Davidians were operating an illegal drug lab at Mount Carmel. So the Green Berets did help the ATF. They helped train their agents, and they even began to create a mock-up of Mount Carmel so that if a future attack was to happen, it could be well planned, and one was being planned. They called it Operation Trojan Horse, and there are some that claim that even though this was the official name, the agents on the ground who were involved in the planned attack called it Operation Showtime. The ATF disputes this. They claim that Showtime was just the code word or the signal word used over the radio to let the agents know when it was time to basically surge into Mount Carmel. Either way, I think it was a little bit tacky, but why was it called Operation Trojan Horse? In the months leading up to the raid, ATF presence in Waco showed itself to the Branch Davidians in many ways. In mid-January, an advanced crew arrived and began to set up on a nearby airstrip. But even before then, on January 10th, 1993, the Branch Davidians got some new neighbors. There were 2 houses located directly adjacent to the main building at Mount Carmel, and these 2 houses were owned by a rancher named Perry Spoon. Now, he rented one of them out, but the other one was empty and had been for quite some time, and Perry had told the people at Mount Carmel that he had no plans of renting this house out. So everybody was surprised when they saw 4 men moving into this house. David and his inner circle were immediately suspicious. These men appeared to be in their mid-30s to early 40s. They all drove brand new cars. They all wore nice clothes, expensive sunglasses, and Rolex watches. Why had men like these, who clearly valued the finer things in life, chosen to move into a farmhouse together that was abandoned with very little furniture inside? David sent a welcoming committee of 3 men, including David Jones, over to meet their new neighbors and welcome them to the neighborhood. And they brought pizza and beer, but they were once again suspicious when the guy who answered the door didn't want them to see inside and was kind of cold and short and distant. But a few days later, their neighbors did visit them, but they seemed to be spending a good amount of time looking around and asking questions. Later that night, one of the men returned alone, and he claimed his name was Robert Gonzalez. He also claimed that he and his housemates had just enrolled at the technical college in Waco, and that he was studying philosophy there, which made people even more suspicious because they were all familiar with Waco. Many of them had gone to that college, and they knew that this wasn't a school you went to if you were studying philosophy. At one point, David Koresh looked at their guest and said, "You're probably with the government, Robert, but I won't let that bother me." And when Gonzalez tried to protest, David told him, "Maybe I can show you something you don't know, but really want to see. Maybe you went to a Catholic school and no one could answer your questions. Maybe I can." Wayne Martin, who, as we discussed in the previous video, was already a suspicious man, especially when it came to the government, was really unsettled by the arrival of these men. He wrote down their license plates, and because he was a lawyer and he had the capability to do these things, he had them run and discovered that they were all registered to the same address, the ATF office in Houston. He and many others urged David to close the doors of Mount Carmel to these men, saying they were clearly from the government and they were there to spy. But Koresh felt that he could get through to Gonzalez and turn him, so that he might go back to his superiors and tell them that the people at Mount Carmel weren't really a threat at all. Gonzalez spent a lot of time with Koresh and the inhabitants of Mount Carmel in the following weeks. He would sit with them while they talked about the Bible, he played with the kids, and sometimes he didn't even leave until midnight. One time they even showed him an anti-ATF documentary, but Robert Gonzalez was there for one thing, to find evidence that the group was stockpiling illegal guns. One afternoon, he came over for target practice, and he brought his own gun with him, an illegal AR-15. He handed it over to David Koresh, and he was basically like, "Hey, is this a good gun? What do you think of this gun?" Obviously trying to prompt David Koresh to admit that he had similar guns. After taking it apart and looking at it, David announced to Robert that this gun had been modified, that it was illegal and a very dangerous weapon. Gonzalez produced another gun, a handgun this time, saying that he'd put it together himself using parts. Once again, Koresh told him that it had been modified, that it was illegal, and that he needed to take care of it. And obviously, what Gonzalez was trying to do was elicit a confession of sorts from David Koresh and the Branch Davidians. He figured by bringing over illegal guns that had been modified, the very thing that the ATF suspected the Branch Davidians of doing, he would be aligning himself with them. And they would feel more comfortable with him and eventually open up to him and maybe show him their illegal guns or show him where they kept them, because that's really what he was there for. He was there to prove that they had illegal guns on the compound and to find out where they were stored. And I suppose this might have worked, but they already knew that he was a government agent before he even stepped foot on their property. I'm not sure why the ATF didn't plan better. I don't know if they underestimated the intelligence of David Koresh, or if they just weren't thinking, maybe a little bit of both. But to send grown men over to live in a house who all are wearing nice clothes and Rolexes and driving new cars, it doesn't add up to the college student's story. And maybe they could have driven cars that weren't registered to the ATF office in Houston. And many will point to the story and say, "Ha, see, David Koresh didn't have illegal guns. He told Gonzalez that they were illegal and dangerous and that he should take care of them." But no, obviously I don't see it that way. That's absolutely ridiculous. It would have been incredibly idiotic for him to bring this man who he suspected of being an ATF agent to his stockpile of illegal guns. This was just an act, a ploy to convince Robert that they were completely normal people, they had nothing to hide, and that they didn't support illegal weapons. Basically, Koresh wanted to use Robert Rodriguez as an instrument that would hopefully lead to their absolution from scrutiny by the government. But according to David Thibodeau, Koresh actually really liked Gonzalez. He thought that he was a good person who seemed to be spiritually hungry. And even later, during the raid, when the FBI called inside the compound and asked Steve Schneider why they didn't confront Gonzalez about his double agent act, Steve said, quote, "Well, because he's a possible guy. Here's a soul, maybe. Here's someone like myself. We still love people so much. You give them the opportunity, even if it's 1 out of a million, and we loved that guy. I mean, we spent enough time with him where we really do appreciate the man's character and personality." I believe Gonzalez did his best to find evidence of illegal guns on the compound, but he didn't find any evidence. And he reported this to his supervisors. However, David's hopes would be crushed when Gonzalez's report didn't deter the ATF from continuing to pursue their vendetta against Koresh and the Branch Davidians. The ATF had their reasons, but I suspect that they were motivated less by fear of Koresh and the Branch Davidians and more by self-preservation. In mid-November of 1992, the television program 60 Minutes reached out to the ATF to get a comment from them on a segment that they were planning on doing, and it pertained to harassment allegations against the agency. In 1990 and 1992, several black ATF agents had filed lawsuits against the agency, claiming discrimination in hiring and promoting practices. This was right on the heels of Ruby Ridge the past August. The ATF knew that they didn't need any more bad publicity, especially considering they had a big budget meeting coming up in March. When the 60 Minutes report aired on January 10th, it dealt a huge blow to the agency and its future prospects. They had already faced large budget cuts in the past, and there was even talk about dissolving the ATF altogether and redistributing its responsibilities. There was a lot riding on this March budget meeting. Did the ATF think that a big success at Mount Carmel would prove to the world that they did have a purpose and a place in law enforcement? Is that why they reached out to several media outlets to make sure that there was reporters and cameras on scene the day the raid was planned? To get it all on camera and broadcast it to the world? The Branch Davidians knew for weeks that there was something in the works, that something big was coming, which was the first major misstep on behalf of the ATF. They had wanted to go into that compound with the element of surprise on their side. Yet it seems they did everything besides hire a skywriter to announce their arrival. Like I said, the undercover agents who had moved into that abandoned farmhouse and were living yards away from the Branch Davidians, they were middle-aged men driving expensive cars and claiming to be college students. The residents at the compound had already seen cameras being set up and pointing right at their home, and with increased media attention on the Branch Davidians at Mount Carmel, they just could feel that something was up, something big was coming. First, I'm going to talk about the February 28th raid, what happened and what the original plan was, and then we'll discuss how the ATF messed it up royally. Armed with a search warrant, the 76 ATF special agents arrived at Mount Carmel on the morning of February 28th. They were riding in covered horse trailers, and they claimed they'd picked this time specifically because the men would be either at work or constructing a shelter that they'd been building. This would put them in a different location than the women and children, as well as the weapons. Therefore, everything should go down peacefully and with no loss of life. However, it had rained quite a bit in the days before, and work on that shelter had been halted while they waited for it to drain out. And besides that, the Branch Davidians knew they were coming. They had gotten a heads up. The day of the raid, a local television news van stopped a USPS worker and asked him for directions to Mount Carmel because he was lost. And he accidentally let it slip that something big was happening there that day. This postman was David Jones, and he immediately sped towards Mount Carmel to tell David Koresh that today was the day. This was the day they'd been planning for. Many times you'll see it reported that the Davidians had about 45 minutes to prepare once David Jones got the heads up, but in reality, I think it was a lot longer. They had a lot more time to prepare than 45 minutes. They'd been on the offensive for weeks. They'd already known something was up and there was something in the air for weeks. The women had even sewn these bulletproof vests for the men to wear. They were way more prepared than 45 minutes could ever give them. And that's not David Jones' fault, and that's not the news truck guy's fault. That's the ATF's fault for going into Waco and sending, undercover agents there that were the worst undercover agents in all of history, and just pretty much announcing their arrival in every way that they possibly could. So these ATF agents, they pull up to Mount Carmel, and according to one ATF agent who was there that day, his name is Robert Elder, almost immediately after stepping out of the vehicles, they heard the sound of gunfire. One of the big questions about what happened that day is who shot first, the ATF or the Branch Davidians? And that question has yet to be answered with any kind of certainty. Depending on who you talk to and what side they're on, you'll get very different answers. Later, many agents would testify that they were shot at as soon as they arrived. But it would come out that many of them also weren't sure whether this was an unprompted attack, as there was some question as to whether or not the first shot had been fired by an ATF agent who was killing a dog on the compound, causing those inside to believe that they were being shot at and responding in kind. The first few agents that were on the scene were tasked with taking care of the dogs. There was a handful of Alaskan Malamutes who lived on the property and were considered to be the pets of the children who took care of them and fed them. These agents were armed with fire hydrants and guns to use against the dogs, and for some reason, because I'm not sure what kind of risk these dogs would pose to the agents, but for some reason, their first order of business was to take out the dogs before even going into the compound or talking to anybody in the compound. And they did end up actually taking out about 5 of these dogs, just murdering them in cold blood. Several ATF agents would later testify that when they arrived, they did hear gunshots, but they assumed that it was the few agents who were supposed to get out of the cars first and take out the dogs. They assumed that the gunfire was from them, taking care of the dogs. That had been the plan. They were going to get out of the vehicles, dispatch the dogs, knock on the door, and arrest David Koresh, whose name was the only one listed on the warrant, by the way. So the only person they were there for was Koresh. As they were running towards the door to knock on it and arrest David Koresh, Special Agent Balastros claims that he saw Koresh exit the house. He was standing in the open doorway, unarmed, with both hands braced on either end of the door jamb, and Balastros yelled at him that they were the police, that they had a warrant, and that he should lay down, while he ran towards him, his gun pointed directly at the unarmed man in the doorway. Koresh responded something like, "What's going on?" before stepping back inside and closing the door before Balastros closed the gap between them. Another agent testified that he saw Koresh with nothing in his hands and made the call that he was not a danger to his fellow agents, but he pulled his pistol out anyways and aimed it at him to encourage him to comply with the ATF's orders. When Balastros reached the house and tried to open the door, which had been closed, that's when bullets fired from inside the compound out, and he was shot in his left hand and he hit the ground. Now, of course, the Branch Davidians inside the compound would tell a completely different story. They said that basically these ATF agents just started shooting as they were running up to the house. Who knows what the real story is? And there are some ballistic experts and forensic experts who examined the scene. And it's hard to tell because a lot of the bullet holes did appear to come from outside the compound. But were they fired after the Branch Davidians fired on them from the inside? It's really hard to tell. What followed, however, is not in question, a roughly 45-minute firefight, which left 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians dead and many other wounded. Additionally, the National Guard, on the direction of the ATF, had dispatched 3 helicopters to accompany these ground agents, and inside the helicopters were all armed ATF agents with cameras. The helicopter thing is also highly in question and highly debated. They were supposed to arrive seconds before the ATF agents on the ground did, and they were going to do this for one, to distract the Branch Davidians inside the compound from seeing the ground agents, and also they were just supposed to hover over the compound until the ground agents had secured the compound, and then they would land and provide backup. However, this doesn't seem to have happened according to plan, even though they say it did. Now, the people in the helicopters claim that they arrived just about the same time as the ground agents did, and when they got there, they already heard gunfire happening from the ground. They could see the other agents getting out of their truck, and then they heard shooting sounds like popcorn, and then they themselves in the helicopters felt bullets hitting their helicopters. The ATF agents inside the helicopters also claimed that they never flew directly over the compound. And as soon as they were shot at, they left, got out of there for fear of being shot down and grounded. However, a reporter and a cameraman were driving to Mount Carmel at around the same time. Obviously, they'd gotten the heads up from the ATF that this was going down. So they were actually just about half a mile away from Mount Carmel when the helicopters arrived, and they saw them. So they were like, oh, something's happening. Let's get out and record this. They saw one of the helicopters make one pass and then another directly over the roof of Mount Carmel at a very low altitude. They were able to get the camera turned on just in time to capture that helicopter make a third pass over the compound, directly over Mount Carmel's north side, inches from the roof. As they were filming this, 2 cattle trailers filled with ATF agents passed them on the road. Not only does it seem the ATF was dishonest about their flight patterns and their proximity to Mount Carmel, but it appears they lied about the timing of the plan as well. They claimed the agents were already getting out of their cars and getting shot at when they arrived, but the news crew can prove that the helicopter arrived quite a bit of time before the ATF agents did, because they passed them on the road half a mile away from Mount Carmel after the helicopter had already passed over the compound 3 times. A Branch Davidian named Marjorie Thomas, who'd been present when this happened, testified that she and 2 other women were on the north side of the building, and they watched out the window as the 3 helicopters approached. They could see a person hanging out the side of the front one, and within seconds they heard the sounds of shots being fired, which went through the window they were standing at and shattered it. Another woman who survived also claimed to hear fire coming from above before the ground agents had even arrived, and Kathy Schroeder, who inspected their water tanks after the raid, claimed she saw bullet holes on them, which could have only happened from above. Other eyewitnesses inside the compound supported the statements of these 3 women, saying that the helicopters opened fire 25 yards east of the cafeteria, just beyond the water tower, firing towards the residential tower where David Koresh lived. Most of the survivors believe that this spray of bullets coming from the helicopters was responsible for the deaths of 3 Branch Davidians, Peter Gent, Peter Hipsman, and Winston Blake. Peter Gent had been found at the water tower. He'd been working for weeks inside the water tower, building supports on its interior walls, and was there again that morning when the helicopters showed up. Many questioned how this man could have been shot by ground agents when he was in this escalated and higher position. According to Lowell Sprague, one of the ATF agents on the ground, Gent had fired at him from his position on the water tower, and Sprague had fired back and hit him from 4 stories below. Peter Gent's autopsy suggested that the trajectory of the bullet that had killed him had come from above, not below. Now, I'd like to stress that depending on the position Peter Gent was in when he was shot at, it would change the trajectory and what it meant. If he'd been bent over, for instance, over the water tower, it may have looked as if the bullet had come from the air when in fact it had come from the ground. No one was with him when he died, so there was nobody to testify as to what he had been doing or who actually killed him. However, I'm no gun expert, but I feel that a moving target 4 stories up would be really hard to accurately hit, especially if you were being shot at from inside the compound as the ATF agents claimed they were. But like I said, I don't know, maybe Lowell Sprague was a sharpshooter. Maybe the Green Berets had really given him a lot of pointers, and he'd learned so much in the past months about, shooting a man who was shooting at you from 4 stories up on a water tower while bullets were coming out of a house that was right next to you. Who knows? Additionally, later, when some of the children were removed from Mount Carmel, they drew pictures for the psychologists that were working with them. And their crayon sketches showed a Mount Carmel under attack from helicopter fire, with bullet holes drawn into the roof. Peter Hipsman was either in one of the 2 rooms above the chapel when he was shot, or in the 4th-story bedroom when he was shot. He was in the 4th-story bedroom when he died, and he suffered 4 bullet wounds. One wound was referred to as being between the 7th ribs on his left and right sides and was shot at an even keel, meaning on level with him, which discounts the likelihood that it was shot from the ground. After the raid and before the siege, 2 men were allowed to enter the compound, and these 2 men were allowed to enter because they were lawyers who had been hired by David Koresh's mother, Bonnie, to basically represent David Koresh and Steve Schneider. And one was a former Marine Corps Reserve colonel, as well as a former combat artillery officer. They both claimed and testified to the fact that they saw bullet holes in the ceiling of the 4th floor room that Hipsman was killed in. They claimed due to the trajectory of these bullet holes, there was only 2 ways they could have been made, either fired from somebody standing on the roof or fired from the helicopters. Now, we can say that there may have been conflict of interest since they were there to represent Koresh and Schneider, but both David Koresh and Stephen Schneider would die later in the siege, and these lawyers testified to this after the fact, and they really didn't have any loyalty to anybody. They just met these men. They weren't getting paid any longer, and they didn't have a conflict of interest, in my opinion. I guess what I'm saying is their motive for lying about that, to me, would be unclear. They claimed the building material and the wallpaper was hanging down, so as if it was punched in, meaning that the bullet holes had come from outside and up, down into the room, not from inside of the room and shot out. Winston Blake, on the other hand, is another story. His wound, which was located below his ear, was determined to have been made at close range, and it's believed he was the victim of accidental friendly fire. He was wearing black clothes and a bulletproof vest that had been made for him by the Branch Davidian women, and it's believed that he looked similar to the ATF agents and someone accidentally shot him. Now let's get back to David Koresh, who has greeted the ATF agents unarmed, but has failed to obey their commands, instead running and hiding inside a house where all his followers were waiting. He claims that when the agents pulled up, he'd gone outside to be friendly and cooperative and see what he could do to help them. But they were in full tactical gear, running towards him at top speed, pointing their guns at him and shouting things at him that he could hear but didn't understand. He likened it to being at a football game when you hear the roar of the crowd, but you don't know what any one person is saying. Then, before he knew it, they were shooting at him, and he yelled at them to stop. He said, "There's women and children inside here. Stop shooting." But they didn't. So he slammed the door shut and barricaded himself inside, where the women and children were. Now, who do we believe? We can get into specifics and forensics, but let's talk about what mainstream media has told us about this situation. That's more than likely not true. Now, in the Waco miniseries, we see David Koresh actually leave the house and walk towards the agents, and he does say, like, "Hey, how can I help you?" or whatever. And then they start shooting at him, and then he yells at them, "There's women and children in here," and he runs back inside after being wounded. And this seems obviously horrible. That should never happen. I don't care who he was or what he did. That should never happen. But Koresh never actually walked out of the house. And when they were shouting at him to get down, that they were the ATF and they were there to arrest him, he ran away and went inside instead. And he would tell many different stories about how he received the wound that day. He also claimed he'd been holding his 2-year-old daughter when they shot at him and that she'd been killed. He told FBI negotiators later, "You killed my baby. I was holding my daughter, the agents shot at me, and now she's dead." First of all, let's clear that up. If such a child ever existed, nobody knew who she was. There's no evidence that there was ever a 2-year-old there in his arms who was killed by the ATF that day. Additionally, Perry Jones, David's father-in-law, was shot that day allegedly, and he too died from his wounds. Multiple people who were around the front door when David Koresh was shot at and Perry Jones was shot claims that they heard Perry Jones yell out, I've been shot," and grab onto his stomach. Now, everybody basically heard him yelling because he made a big deal. People even said that it was obnoxious at one point because he was just screaming and freaking out. And like 3 or 4 men had to help Perry into a bedroom where he was laid down on a bed. And he ended up dying an hour later, allegedly from this wound he'd received from ATF fire. However, the victims of the raid were later buried under the dirt floor of the bunker. And when his corpse was examined, it showed that Perry Jones had died from a single gunshot wound through the roof of his mouth. Some believe that he may have taken his own life. Others believe that he may have been creating such a fuss and was allegedly in so much pain that somebody else did it for him, a mercy kill. Others believe that he really did cry out saying he'd been shot, but he hadn't. He just wanted to get away from the fighting. You know, he was an older guy. He was in his 60s. He probably didn't want to have anything to do with this gunfight going on. So he pretended that he'd been shot and held his stomach. That way he could be taken away from where the concentration of the fighting was happening. And then because he made such a big deal and kept fussing about it, somebody came in and put him out of his misery, essentially. There is evidence for these theories. Clive Doyle had been with Perry and had helped him into the room, and he claimed that Perry was basically just in so much pain. He was hysterical and he was freaking everybody out, and he asked Clive to ask David Koresh if he could end it all. So basically Perry's like, I want to kill myself. I don't want to live like this. I'm in pain and I'm dying slowly. Ask David Koresh if it's okay if, I take my own life. And David Koresh had said, hang in there. Tell him to hang in there. But then an hour later, he was dead. Now, according to David Thibodeau, he'd seen Perry bleeding from wounds in his stomach, even though Perry's autopsy showed he had no wounds there. Now, David Thibodeau, he explains this away by saying that by the time they had gotten Perry's body in order to do the autopsy, it was severely decomposed, so it hadn't been, an appropriate autopsy. But I don't know how much a body can decompose to the point where you wouldn't be able to notice or see if they'd been shot in the abdomen. I think that there'd be something there to say that, especially if you could still see the gunshot wound in his mouth. So once again, it's really hard to believe or take anything completely seriously that David Thibodeau says, because he was an enabler of a child pedophile. Kathy Schroeder believed that a man, another Davidian named Neil Viega, had shot Perry because he'd come in and asked David for permission to end Perry's life because he was suffering, and David had given it to him. And then obviously Perry was found dead with that gunshot wound in the roof of his mouth. It's more likely that Perry Jones was killed by either himself or somebody trying to help him and end his suffering, rather than the shot of an ATF agent. Now, that 2-year-old girl, Koresh's daughter, that he'd claimed had been in his arms when they shot at him and who had died, like I said, she appears to never have existed. After the raid, they took all of their dead and they buried them in the same place, under the dirt floor in the bunker, and her body was not with the others. Later, when Steve Schroeder was asked about this little girl, he stammered, he kind of got caught up on his words, and then he said he thinks she may have been resurrected. And when David Koresh was asked later by the FBI negotiators about this little girl, he basically threw a fit and he was like, I never said that. I never said that you guys killed my 2-year-old daughter. Never said that, and you can't prove I did. That night, David Koresh called his mother, but she didn't answer, so he left her a message. He said, hello, Mama, it's your boy. They shot me and I'm dying, all right? But I'll be back real soon, okay? I'll see y'all in the skies. Now, if you look at David Koresh's autopsy report from later, obviously after he died, it does say that there was an old healing gunshot wound on his body. But who was he shot by? And when was he shot? He could have been shot by any number of the ATF agents, but was it at the door when they initially came, or was it later at some point during that 45 to 50 minute gunfight? He claimed sometimes that he had been in his room just sitting there and he got shot. He gave all different stories of how he received his injury, which almost leads me to believe that either he didn't know when it happened or it may have happened by one of his own people accidentally. There's a lot of speculation out there saying that he was creating this army, but at the end of the day, they were no army. At least they were not a good army. These people weren't trained by military personnel to carry guns and shoot guns, and I almost wonder if he may have been hit by a friendly fire bullet accidentally, but he wanted to make it seem as if the ATF had hit him. Once again, there really is no way to say for sure. There was another man who died in a very controversial way that day, and I want to tell his story because to me, it's a sad one, and it also does raise questions about who's telling the truth here. Michael Schroeder was a Branch Davidian, but he worked and lived off the compound at an auto repair shop the Branch Davidians owned in Waco. When he heard about what was happening at Mount Carmel, he obviously tried to get back to the compound to check on his wife and child, and he was then apprehended by ATF agents and shot roughly 7 times. They claimed that he'd shot at them first, and his body remained there in a gully for 4 days. There are those who insist to this day that he was not armed and he was killed for no reason other than for being a part of the Branch Davidians. His family that remained afterwards, including Kathy Schroeder, who was his wife and became a witness for the defense later, she claims that he was killed by the ATF. His family believes that he was killed by the ATF and he wasn't armed. They describe him as being this really gentle, nice guy who just wasn't a violent person. The truth is one of those things in this situation that's so hard to determine and so hard to find. You really don't even know what to believe. You really don't even know what you want to believe, honestly. And I would like to believe that a single man coming towards these ATF agents who were armed would not be shot at if he was unarmed. I'd like to believe that if they did shoot him that many times, that he at least would have shot at them first and given them some reason to, I don't know, shoot at him. But at the same time, you've got more than one ATF agent, one single guy. Was there a different way you could have approached this man rather than shooting him 7 times? I don't know. I'm not a police officer. I'm not an FBI agent, an ATF agent. I don't know what I would do in those situations, but that's a main reason that I would never be a police officer or, an ATF agent in the field with my life in jeopardy, because I feel like I would be that person who would be so scared every time someone approached me that I would just accidentally shoot them out of fear. I know they're probably not trained to do that and to keep a cooler head, but at the same time, that's human nature. You're going to do what it takes to keep yourself alive. And I feel like sometimes people get killed when they don't need to because the agents or the police officers are afraid for their own lives. And that's why I could never do that job. And I don't think anybody who really can't keep a cool head in those situations or find a peaceful or non-violent alternative to just shooting somebody dead because you think they're going to shoot you, I don't think they should do those jobs. In my opinion, don't come for me. A ceasefire was finally called at 11:30 a.m. The ATF removed their wounded agents and retreated, and the Branch Davidians tended to their wounded and counted their dead. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. Were the Branch Davidians innocent, non-violent victims of the ATF's attack? In my opinion, no, not really. They had a good 45 minutes to prepare at the least, right? Because we discussed that they probably had longer. They knew the agents were on their way, and Koresh began handing out guns to all the men, having them put on these bulletproof vests, and basically posting them in windows on the 2nd story so that they would be almost like snipers when the ATF agents arrived. And that doesn't show to me that you're ready for a peaceful surrender or you want things to go well, in my opinion. And as far as David Koresh is concerned, I'm sure the sight of armed men running towards him, shouting at him, was scary. But at the same time, the ATF was there for David Koresh. And had he walked out unarmed as he was, I doubt that they would have shot him since they had cameras all over the place. They knew they had cameras there because they'd called to make sure they were there. And that would have looked incredibly bad for them. And he was the only one they wanted. If he really cared about the people that were inside, he would have gone out, laid on the ground with his hands visible, and they would have grabbed him up and arrested him. But instead, he's yelling at them, "Don't shoot, there's women and children in here." Yet he runs back into the building where the women and children are that he allegedly wants to protect, while he has an army of men in all the windows with guns trained on these agents. Had Koresh surrendered, had Koresh gone out with his hands up, laid on the ground, and let the ATF agents lead him away, none of the violence, none of the death that occurred in the following weeks would have happened, in my opinion. But why did the ATF make the choice to arrest Koresh in the way that they did? Why had they called the media and told them where to be and when to be there if they wanted a big story? Was this a publicity stunt intended to cast a more positive light on an agency that had been suffering from a bad reputation? Many believe that it was. The day before the raid, a local paper, the Waco Herald Tribune, published its first part in a 7-part series on the cult and the man behind it. They called it The Sinful Messiah. It started off saying, if you are a Branch Davidian, Christ lives on a threadbare piece of land 10 miles east of Waco called Mount Carmel. He has dimples, claims a 9th grade education, married his legal wife when she was 14, enjoys a beer now and then, plays a mean guitar, reportedly packs a 9mm Glock, and keeps an arsenal of military assault rifles, and willingly admits he is a sinner without equal. Needless to say, it did not paint a flattering picture of David Koresh and the Branch Davidians, and the articles to follow were not any better. The article also made a statement about law enforcement turning a blind eye to this potentially very dangerous situation. After listing the charges that had been made against Koresh from the affidavit written by Davy Aguilera, the paper stated, "The law watches but has done little." In fact, the paper had been in contact with law enforcement and the ATF, and they were well aware that the agency was preparing to raid the compound. The Tribune had actually planned on publishing these articles at the beginning of March, but for some reason their timeline changed and they contacted the Sheriff's Department and the ATF to let them know the stories would be publishing sooner than they thought. Many believe this prompted the ATF to move up the date of the raid, feeling that they could not allow these articles to publish, questioning the inaction of law enforcement without having an action to counter these accusations. And like I said, the ATF, they'd been in contact with the media for days before the raid, making sure that they would be on the spot when it went down. Because if a tree falls in a forest and nobody's around to see it, did it really fall? If people couldn't turn on their nightly news and see the brave actions of the ATF putting a stop to a dangerous cult, did they actually do it? The ATF wanted to make sure that the world would know what part they played in bringing an end to David Koresh and his evil ways. And this would backfire on them. Every agent that went to that compound that day was equipped not only with a gun and his weapons or her weapons, but a camera as well. And as we said at the beginning of this video, the whole point of the raid, the whole thing that was on their side was the element of surprise. Chuck Sarabin, the tactical leader of the operation at that time, had been explicitly told to call it off if he felt that the element of surprise had been lost. And I would argue that the element of surprise had never been had. It was never there. Not only did the ATF do very little to maintain secrecy, Sarabin had ample proof that the Davidians knew the ATF was coming. And he didn't call it off. How could he do that when he had a whole army of reporters and cameramen standing by waiting to capture something? How could he call them and tell them that it was off, that nothing was happening, that there was no story, that the ATF really was as inept as everybody made them out to be? How could he call it off when the papers were accusing the ATF and local law enforcement of doing nothing to stop what David Koresh and the Branch Davidians were doing? How could he do? He couldn't, right? He couldn't. It makes no sense from a PR standpoint. Robert Rodriguez showed up in Mount Carmel the morning of the raid with part 2 of The Sinful Messiah in his hand. No one could really figure out why he was there. Was he there to spy some more and gather some last-minute intel, or had he really begun to align himself with these people? Now, while Rodriguez was there, David Jones ran in, just having been tipped off by the cameraman in the news truck, and he pulled David Koresh aside and he was like, "It's happening. They're coming. They're on their way here now." David Koresh went back to Rodriguez, who's probably sweating bullets by now, and he's like, "Well, Robert, they're coming. You gotta do what you gotta do." Being there would have been actually really dangerous for Robert Rodriguez, considering they knew he was a federal agent, and he knew that they knew because David Koresh would always kind of like mess with him about it and be like, "I know you work for the government, but I think you're a good guy." So they knew he was from the government or worked for the government. And now they knew that the ATF was on their way to the compound. So being there for Rodriguez was extremely dangerous because technically they could have grabbed him. They could have used him as a hostage and used him to get leverage, but they didn't. happened. Why? Was it because Koresh really liked Robert Rodriguez? Was it because they weren't the hostage-taking types? Maybe, but I think it was mainly because Koresh was hoping Rodriguez would once again go to his superiors and tell them to call it off. And that's exactly what Robert Rodriguez did. He ran to his car, he got in his car, he sped to his little rented farmhouse, and he called Chuck Sarabin, and he said, "They know you're coming. They know we need to call this off." The element of surprise is gone. It's a fabrication. It doesn't exist. Do not send your agents into an ambush. But Chuck Sarabin did not call it off. He said that Koresh was always worried that the government was coming for him. He said Koresh was always telling people the government was coming for him. This wasn't enough evidence. It wasn't strong enough to say that they specifically knew they were coming that day. But in fact, Robert Rodriguez had specifically told him, yes, they know you're in your trucks coming to their compound now. They are preparing. And there would be a big fight legally later on between Robert Rodriguez and Sarabin and some of the other superiors. And they basically tried to throw Rodriguez under the bus and blame him for the whole thing failing and the whole thing being, blowing up in their faces, essentially. And he was like, oh no, not today. Not today, guys. This is not happening. I'm not going to take the hit for this one. And do you think that Sarabin would at least call the agents or, contact them and be like, hey, they may know you're coming, so be a little bit more careful. You may be walking into an ambush. No, not at all. And as far as I'm concerned, the 4 ATF agents who died that day, February 28th, Chuck Sarabin is fully responsible for that because he had it in his power to end it, to regroup, to plan something better. And he didn't. He willingly put his own men and women in danger and in a terrible position so that he didn't have to reschedule his press conference and call all the media and tell them that, it was going to be another day. In my opinion, allegedly. The ATF had sent well-dressed, middle-aged men to live right next door to the Branch Davidians and claimed to be college students. Nobody in the world logically would have thought that these men were college students. Sharon Wheeler, an ATF agent, had already scheduled a press conference for after the raid before it even happened. ATF agents had been checking into the hotels at Waco for the past couple of days, bragging to the locals about how they were going to go into the compound and take care of those crazy religious fanatics. There was no element of surprise to even be lost here, and the fact that the ATF pulled up on Mount Carmel, guns blazing with helicopters carrying more armed agents flying above, this gave the sinful Messiah a way to ensure that the prophecy he'd been preaching for years would finally come true. He played the government like he played his guitar. He used them as an instrument to prove his direct line to God. To those who followed him and believed in him, the government coming for them, shooting at them, busting in their home, it was everything he'd been telling them, playing out before their eyes. Additionally, there was absolutely no need for this big song and dance that the ATF put on for the media. The warrant they had was for David Koresh, so why not arrest him away from the compound? After everything went down, residents from Waco came forward saying, I don't know why they didn't just arrest him in town. He's always here. He comes into town every weekend. He's hanging out at the bars. He's talking to people. We all know him. Additionally, he was known to run the same route every morning, sometimes with David Thibodeau or Steve Schneider, sometimes by himself. He ran the same route almost every morning off of the compound. The undercover ATF agents had seen him running by their house every morning on Double E Ranch Road. It's ridiculous. Why didn't they arrest him when he was in town, grabbing groceries or grabbing a beer with his buddies? Why didn't they arrest him when he was on his morning run? Well, the ATF claimed they had information that he hadn't left Mount Carmel for months. Basically, he'd locked himself in the compound, and that was absolutely untrue. And I'm pretty sure they knew it was not true because their undercover agents had told them that. And they had people in Waco who were telling them that. And in the end, they admitted that they really didn't know anything about his movements because they didn't have him under 24/7 surveillance. So they just wanted to show. They wanted to show. It's so much more dramatic. It's so much more interesting for the viewers at home watching their TVs to see this entire siege of a whole compound than to see, one guy get arrested on his morning run. So we have a lot of mistakes on the part of the ATF, a lot. And had they done really any of these things differently, it surely would have made for a less media-friendly event, but it would have made for one that didn't result in a loss of life, one that did not result in almost 100 federal agents firing into a building where multiple unarmed innocent children lived. The ATF agents claimed that before they'd gone to the compound, they'd gone to the drugstores or the grocery stores and they'd gotten candy for the kids who they were going to bring out, knowing they'd probably be stressed out and worried and scared. And yet, knowing that the kids are going to be stressed out and worried and scared, so you have candy for them, you still take your gun and shoot into a building where they live? They threw in flashbang grenades, also called stun grenades. Historically, they've been used by law enforcement in the United States during riot situations for crowd control, and they're designed to produce a blinding flashing light as well as an intensely loud bang sound, but they're an incendiary device and they can become very hot, which can cause physical injury to those in the vicinity of them when they go off. Additionally, no arrangements had been made by the ATF to treat their wounded. They hadn't set up like a base where they had a dispensary or medical professionals in case anybody was wounded. They literally had to carry their wounded comrades down this dirt road. Sometimes they'd throw them over the hood of their cars so they could get them out. It was horrible. It was disorganized. It was horrible. I don't know if they planned this specifically because they were so cocky going in. They thought that there was going to be no injuries or loss of life on their side, or if they thought that it was just going to go perfectly. But even if you think you have it all perfectly planned, there should still be a backup plan in case somebody does get injured and they need medical treatment and medical help, and they didn't plan for any of that. What if a child inside had gotten shot and the Branch Davidians had brought this child out and they were like, this child is shot, we surrender, but please help this little boy or this little girl. And the ATF agents would have been like, well, we can drive them 10 miles into Waco because we don't have anything set up here, which went completely against protocol. They should have had something there, somebody who was medically trained to help wounded people, but they didn't. So it was just a mess, and it was a stupid decision. Once the shooting had started, Wayne Martin, the lawyer, he called 911, and he got a sheriff's deputy in Waco on the phone. The sheriff deputy was Larry Lynch, and Wayne Martin basically told him, listen, we're being attacked by the government. They're shooting at us. There's women and children in here. Tell them to call it off. And Larry Lynch was like, oh shit, what's going on? Let me try to call them. But he couldn't call them. He couldn't call them because nobody on the ground at Mount Carmel had a mobile phone on them. They didn't even have the number or the ability to call inside of Mount Carmel if they wanted to negotiate or they wanted to find a peaceful resolution. So there was literally no way for anybody on the outside, the sheriff in Waco, there was no way for them to get a hold of these agents and tell them, pull back or stop or, anything. It's just bananas to me. They didn't have the phone number inside Mount Carmel. They didn't have any way of reaching inside the compound to talk to David Koresh or Steve Schneider and be like, hey, this is what we're here for. This is what we want. It's all going to end peacefully if you just come out. All they did was run towards that place with guns and screaming and full tactical gear, looking like the forces of evil. And why, when things started spiraling out of control, did the ATF not withdraw, regroup, and figure out a better tactic or a better way of going about it? They could have just withdrawn, gone back home, been like, okay, this didn't work. We need somebody else. We need help. We need to bring somebody in, somebody to talk to him. Let's see if we can call him. They just kept running at the building, ran into the building and just started shooting. It doesn't make any sense to me. When you're being shot at and you see that your own people are dying, you're not on a battlefield, you're not given instructions or directions or orders to kill every person you see. You're supposed to be there to extract one person and hopefully not hurt anybody else. And they really just didn't act as if that was what their goal was. There's no doubt that excessive and unnecessary force was used by the ATF that day at Mount Carmel. And as a result, it led to more aggravated situations and more heightened tension. And the ATF's initial raid on February 28th turned into a full-out war, and it didn't have to. The next morning, March 1st, the Attorney General reached out to the White House to update them on the situation. The Clinton administration knew that they were in a standoff with the Branch Davidians now, but they predicted it would last for 10 days tops. How wrong they were. A memo from Bill Clinton's chief of staff clearly stated that the FBI would take no significant action without White House approval, which seems pretty logical, but will also come into play later, because in the aftermath, Bill Clinton would hold up his hands and say that he was not at fault for what happened at all. And let's talk about Janet Reno for a moment. Janet Reno was a lawyer who was chosen to be the country's first female attorney general by Bill Clinton on February 11th, 1993. She stepped into this role in the middle of this huge battle between the ATF and the FBI and the Branch Davidians, and she'd end up playing a very large role in what happened later. March 1st was also the day that the ATF relinquished jurisdiction to the FBI. It was kind of like a big brother coming in to clean up his little brother's mess, like, oh, Johnny, you're always messing things up, and I gotta come in here and fix it. That's how I imagined it went down. And the ATF notoriously was kind of jealous of the FBI, kind of like rivals almost, like, we don't need the FBI, we've got this. So they did not like when the FBI had to come in and clean up their mess, essentially, even though, once again, in my opinion, the FBI did not do a great job of coming in and cleaning up the mess. Some could argue they made more of a mess. But the ATF was still like a squirrel with a nut. They would not let it go. 7 days later, they raided another property near Mount Carmel, a garage that had been rented by one of the Branch Davidians, and they were looking for incriminating evidence against the group. But all they got was another mess. The owner of the garage, who was not affiliated with the Branch Davidians at all, was in disbelief by how much damage the agents had done to his private property. Outraged, he told reporters that they'd torn the place apart, which made no sense considering just the day before he'd offered to give them a key and let them inside. It's like the ATF just wanted to, raid places. It's like they just wanted to forcefully enter places. Maybe when they were getting trained by the special forces on how to go into buildings and, take the buildings, they were like, this is cool. And they almost felt like they were playing Army Man, like they were G.I. Joe. And the guy who owned the garage was like, yeah, you can check in here. Here's the key. And they were like, no, we don't want to unlock the door and walk in. We want to break the door down and surge in with our tactical vests and our guns, and like they're playing Call of Duty or something, like a bunch of little boys and girls playing war. FBI negotiators now had their hands on the situation, and they set up a command post where they could talk daily to David Koresh and the Branch Davidians inside a Mount Carmel that had essentially become a fortress. They were not coming out. And a 50-man FBI hostage rescue team took the place of the ATF agents that had been there before, and they cut the phone lines leaving Mount Carmel so that the Branch Davidians couldn't talk to anybody besides the FBI negotiators. On March 2nd, the FBI allowed David to send a pre-recorded message to a Christian radio station. Now, he'd promised to surrender after it aired, but later Steve Schneider called the negotiators and told them that God had reached out Koresh and told him to wait. There was still more that needed to be done.
It's not against law to buy a firearm. It's not against law to buy anything that they sell at a gun show. And when this is all resolved, hey, yellow sheet is legal. An accusation is not. And bringing these tanks and stuff around here, I tell you what, being an American first, I'm the kind of guy that I'll stand in front of a tank. You can run over me, but I'll be biting one of the tracks. No one's going to hurt me or my family. That's American policy here. You could have arrested me any day as I jog up and down this road. You could have arrested me going to town or going to Walmart. Waco is going to bear witness against the ATF. The two agents across the street over here, Robert Gonzalez, I love the guy. I was honest with him. I brought him into my home. He was going to stay here for 2 weeks. All this stuff you guys may want to avoid and deny. He wanted to tour around the place. I promised him a tour. He could have talked to any of these guys around here, anybody. He was free to come and go as he chose. And I do not appreciate it, and never will I ever appreciate somebody coming here with 2 helicopters and cattle trailers and all that, and pushing people around with guns. Hey, I'll meet you at the doorstep any day. And somebody will get hurt. If you want to keep playing that game, I'm talking to you. Somebody's going to get hurt. Because this ain't America anymore when the ATF has that kind of power to come into anybody's home and kick doors down and things like that.
They brought Bonnie, David's mother, to the compound, hoping she'd be able to talk him into surrendering, but he wouldn't speak to her. He suspected that she was working for the feds. In reality, she just wanted to see her son, and she wanted to see things end without bloodshed like everyone else did, but it didn't work and she left. The negotiators, who felt David liked the spotlight and enjoyed the opportunity to spread his word, they tempted him with promises of big-name television interviews. It was decided that instead he would make a recording of his voice explaining his side of things, and this tape would be played on local radio stations. He made some promises. He said that every time the radio station played his voice, he would let some children leave the compound. He also said that he was working on his manuscript for the Seven Seals, and that was the main reason he didn't want to surrender just yet, knowing that he'd immediately be arrested and then silenced. His first promise he kept. In the early days of the raid, roughly 21 children were allowed to leave Mount Carmel and go into the care of the Texas Department of Child Protective Services. A psychiatrist who worked with these children, who was named Dr. Bruce Perry, he claimed that most of the kids, if not all of the kids, had this pervasive fear in them. They believed that David Koresh was God and he was not to be questioned. 2 young girls who had already been chosen to join the House of David were actually disappointed because now they wouldn't be allowed to. Perry also said he didn't believe that any of the children who came under his care were sexually abused, but they were being primed. They were exposed to sexual content, language, and behaviors that were inappropriate for their age and development. And they were all scared. Scared of their new protectors, who they'd been told were sent to kill them. Their resting heart rates were double what was normal at all times. And simple things like a flushing toilet fascinated them. They didn't flush toilets in Mount Carmel. They didn't have running water. They sang apocalyptic songs and drew disturbing dark images. When asked what their drawings were depicting, the children would creepily answer, "You'll find out." On March 5th, the FBI profilers wrote in an interagency memo that increasing tactical pressure could become counterproductive and eventually lead to the loss of more life. So you've got these FBI profilers, the people who are talking to the negotiators are talking to the people inside the compound. So you would assume that these people, this group of people, know the most about the mental state of the Branch Davidians and David Koresh. And they're telling the FBI, the tactical people, like, don't push anymore. Don't continue to push these people. Give it time. Because if you do, I have a feeling that tensions are just going to rise and things are going to be worse and they're going to explode. Did the FBI listen? For a little while, they did. Now, on March 7th, the FBI requested that Koresh send more children out. And he responded, "No, I've already sent out all the children that I'm willing to send out. What's left in here, these are my children, and they're not going to leave me." So basically what he was saying was the children who were remaining in the compound were all his sons and daughters, which I'm not sure is true, considering that I know a lot of these children were DNA tested after, and some of them were proven to be the offspring of David Koresh, but I'm not sure if it's necessarily true that all of them were, but it's possible. On March 8th, David Koresh had a conversation with a sheriff, Jack Harlowe from Waco. Now, Harlowe told Koresh that he wanted to send milk in for the children that remained, and Koresh answered angrily that he just sent 3 kids out, and in exchange for the milk, the feds wanted him to send out an additional 4. And it was always tough to talk to Koresh on the phone and get anything accomplished because he would, without fail, return to preaching about the Bible and the 7 seals and the book of Revelation. Harlowe would be trying to get a count of how many children were still inside the compound, and Koresh would respond that there wasn't a nation or power in the world that could or would overrule God. And it's kind of hard to read the transcripts of this phone conversation because, it's clear that Harlowe knew Koresh. Like, they were all familiar with each other. Koresh was a well-known figure in Waco. People knew him. Local law enforcement had worked with him before. And both Koresh and Harlowe expressed sentiments of love towards each other. Harlowe's like, "I love you. I love all those people in there. I love the children. I don't want to see anything happen to them. And I want to make sure they're being taken care of." And Koresh is like, "Yeah, man, we love you too. We appreciate you trying to help us out." And it's just so sad because these are 2 men who have common ground, who have a past, a history, and they're on such opposite ends of the spectrum, but it's like they're trying to come back together and realign themselves. And it's so sad that couldn't happen. The Branch Davidians sent out videotapes to the FBI where each member was interviewed and gave their opinion on what was happening and why they felt like being there was the right thing for them. No one was forced to stay there, and many parents had sent their children out into the care of CPS, choosing to stay and fight, next to Koresh. The intention of these tapes was to show that the children were okay and they were being cared for, but to me is just heartbreaking. The intention of these videotapes was to basically show that the children were all right and being cared for, but to me, it's absolutely heartbreaking. Because although so many children were able to get out, so many were left behind. And knowing what happens at the end, seeing their little innocent happy faces on the videotapes, and just having the knowledge of what comes next for them, it broke my heart. It's very difficult. Whenever children are involved, it's very difficult because you can say it's the Branch Davidians' fault because they stayed there, they could have left, but the children didn't have a choice. They stayed with their parents. They stayed when they were told to stay and they left when they were told to leave. They didn't have a choice about it either way. And they'd been raised this way their whole lives. So maybe even if they did have a choice, they wouldn't have left because this was all they knew. This was where their parents were. And it breaks my heart because even if you want to say the Branch Davidians were bad people because they followed a bad man, the children are completely innocent. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's right or wrong besides what they're told. Now, the FBI saw these videotapes and they were at first going to release them publicly, but then they said, oh, these people actually seem like they're not brainwashed. These people actually seem like they are happy and they know very well and logically what they want. And we think it would be a bad move to release them and show the public because they might question why we're attacking all of them and going after these people so hard when they see videotapes of a bunch of normal people just being normal. The next day, March 9th, without consulting the negotiators, the FBI commanders cut power to the compound and the Branch Davidians made a banner that read, "God help us, we want the press." Koresh and his followers believed that if the world could be brought inside Mount Carmel, if they could see their simple and happy lives, the ATF and the FBI would look like bullies who had abused their power and disrupted a happy and peaceful community. The government did not want Koresh or anyone inside that compound giving interviews or speaking to the press, but what they couldn't control was a certain Branch Davidian who'd been out of town when the siege happened. Paul Fata had been at a gun show that day and there was a warrant out for his arrest, but he began giving interviews to the press. Fata had been one of the men by David's side when they shot their way into Mount Carmel while George Roden lived there, and he sat down with the New York Times for 5 hours and he gave the Branch Davidian side of the story, saying that if he'd been at Mount Carmel when the ATF showed up, he would have either hid under his bed or picked up a gun and shot back if it meant protecting his family and the women and the children. The FBI was so heated that Paul was out there giving interviews and they couldn't locate him. They threatened the media outlets that were giving him interviews with criminal punishment if they didn't help them and catch him. The FBI had also been consulting with religious experts in an attempt to understand what the driving force of the Branch Davidians was. On March 11th, these experts gave some frightening opinions. They said they believed David Koresh was interested in being a martyr and dying as such. They said, quote, "I think in his mind, this is the prelude to Armageddon. He's made it pretty clear that to be God's spokesman on earth, to convert the world to Davidism, he's got to become a martyr. He's got to die. Jesus died, and he sees himself in the same vein. He's Jesus in the 20th century. Many of them believed that the situation may not be resolved until Easter, April 11th. One of these experts said, "I think Easter is very critical. After all, when did Jesus die?" Now, Paul Fata had claimed that the Armageddon end of days thing had been fabricated by the government and the media to make David and his followers as scary and unrelatable as possible. He said that David loved the people there, especially the children, and he wouldn't allow anything bad to happen to them, but the religious experts were not so sure. They didn't think that the children would be a top priority for Koresh, not if protecting them got in the way of fulfilling his prophecy. The FBI requested permission from the president to use tear gas to bring things to an end, but this request was denied. This was a day before Janet Reno was sworn in as the new United States Attorney General. Now it was her job to call the shots, and being brand new to this position, really having no expertise or experience, she should not have been handed such an important situation to manage and be in control of, in my opinion. But regardless, she pretty much was. According to Bill Clinton and according to Janet Reno, who pretty much said, she absolved Bill Clinton of any responsibility, they both said that Janet was given, full carte blanche to make the decisions, and she didn't have to check with him first, even though that White House memo said that no FBI action would be taken at Mount Carmel without permission and approval from the White House. But so, okay, I mean, that's just Bill Clinton being Slick Willie again, in my opinion, allegedly. Don't come for me. Don't come for me. Hashtag Clinton body count. Now, on March 12th, the electricity to the compound is permanently cut. And the FBI starts what I would consider to be torture tactics. They shine these bright spotlights into the windows, and they start playing loud music, like these boots are made for walking, which doesn't make sense. Why that song? It's not the worst song in the world, let's be honest, unless Jessica Simpson is singing it, and then it's pretty bad. But they played the sounds of jet planes flying overhead. They played the sounds of rabbits being slaughtered, the screams of rabbits being killed, loudly, 24/7, nonstop, lights shining into the compound, these horrible sounds being played. And I can't imagine what it was like for those inside. Small children were cowering inside, unable to sleep because the lights were always shining in the windows and the sounds were always playing. They were probably legitimately terrified. Terrified. Now, remember the milk that the FBI had sent in the week prior? It wasn't just milk. They'd slipped bugs into the milk crate so that they could listen inside the Branch Davidian compound. And on March 15th, one of these bugs allegedly picked up David Koresh talking about the February 28th raid and laughing about how he'd seen an ATF agent shot and slumped over and dying, and saying things like, well, you know, they shouldn't have come for us. They shouldn't have come. We're going to fight back. We're not going to let them take us. On March 17th, Koresh tells a negotiator, we're saying your commanders are a threat. You're trying to push aside where we're coming from. Therefore, we can't communicate. I'm willing to give and take. I made the first move by sending out the kids. You have continued to digress on the things you promise. You keep yourselves in ignorance. You don't understand. Now, the negotiator responded to him, no, I do understand, but they're running out of patience. And Steve Schneider told them that 20 to 30 people had been ready to surrender and leave the compound before the FBI had permanently cut their electricity. So basically what they were doing, the FBI, they keep doing these things trying to pull these people out, but what they're doing is they're pissing them off and making them afraid of these people that they're supposed to surrender to, so they're staying inside and not leaving. The FBI had brought armored trucks close to the compound and they parked them, and the Branch Davidians took this as a direct threat and a breach of the ceasefire. And in a way, this is what they'd been taught to expect from the ATF and the FBI. A few days later, when 7 members surrendered and came out of their own accord, the FBI answered this seemingly positive development by bulldozing the cars of the Branch Davidians. And on March 30th, an Army veteran named Timothy McVeigh visits the town of Waco. While he's there, he tells locals that what's happening in Mount Carmel is the start of government repression. The world was watching this unfold, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen. On April 4th, 2 lawyers that had been hired by Bonnie, David's mother, to represent the interests of Koresh and Schneider, 2 lawyers we've already spoken about, they announced that the Davidians will surrender after a week-long Passover observation, which they begin the next day on April 5th. 5 days later, FBI agents walk around the compound, creating a perimeter using razor wire. Now, on April 12th, the FBI once again seeks permission from Janet Reno to use tear gas on the people inside the compound. And she says no, but she asks to be briefed further on why they want to use tear gas. Like, do they have a legitimate reason? Can they justify it? So she has to basically get an FBI briefing on the positive aspects of using tear gas. And it must have gone well for the FBI, because the next day on April 17th, Janet Reno approved the tear gas attack. Now, allegedly, the FBI thought this whole 7 Seals manuscript thing was just a way for Koresh to buy time. And many in the agency didn't believe that there was a benefit in waiting for him to finish it or waiting for him to do whatever it was that he had to do. This standoff had been going on for weeks, and it didn't seem like it was close to ending. It didn't seem like people were close to, surrendering. At least David Koresh wasn't, but at the same time, they were making progress. They were getting the children out. They were getting certain people who no longer wanted to be a part of this battle between good and evil to come out and surrender to the authorities. So little by little, they were making progress. And there is something to be said about patience in situations like this. As my Italian uncle says, when we're playing euchre, 1 by 1 is good fishing. So whatever kind of progress you can make is beneficial, and it's better than no progress, and it's better than completely losing everything, which is what I think the FBI didn't understand. There are memos that state there's a few people in the Justice Department who thought there would be a good benefit to being patient and waiting Koresh out. They thought that if they waited long enough, he'd eventually surrender. Just let him do what he has to do. At this point, nobody's really, doing anything wrong. They're just hiding out in there. He's apparently writing his manuscript. The kids seem to be well taken care of. Nobody's shooting at anybody. Let's just let this lie and wait for him to get tired of this game and this gig. These voices of logic and reason thought that Koresh would eventually concede if there was no violence put towards him. They believed that Koresh was trying to draw the FBI into a gunfight to eventually fulfill his prophecy. The end of days, the battle between good and evil. The forces of evil wouldn't wait patiently for the forces of good to finish whatever it was that they were doing. The forces of evil would attack the forces of good and wipe them out. So let's not be the forces of evil. Let's wait patiently and, send in milk and make sure the kids are being fed. But these people can't stay in there forever. In 2 days, the epic, fiery battle that David Koresh had been promising his followers for 9 years would come to fruition, because the FBI and law enforcement and the ATF and politicians in general, they may be a lot of things, but they're not patient. They're not patient at all. And there was a lot of people in the FBI that thought they felt that they were being shown up by Koresh. Like they were being made to look like fools. And they didn't want to look like fools. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. There is a certain level of confidence, ego, invincibility that a person has to have in order to take a job as a police officer or an FBI agent. Obviously, you also want to have characteristics that make you, want justice and to protect people, but there is a certain amount of ego that somebody has to have in order to take that position, because it's dangerous. And at some point, if you realize how dangerous it is, you're just not going to want to put yourself in that position. So you have to have almost this unrealistic ideal of what you're capable of doing. And I think that with the FBI agents, they were listening to these religious experts who were basically saying, he's gonna kill them all. He's gonna kill himself and kill them all. And then you're gonna look bad because you just stood there and let that happen. They were listening to them. They weren't really listening to the FBI negotiators who were saying, just hold off. These people are close. He does seem to be writing a manuscript. Everything seems cool in there for now. So let's just try to let this stretch out for as long as possible without any kind of attack. And, the fact that the FBI kept going to the White House and Janet Reno requesting to use tear gas, it shows me that they had no freaking patience. They just didn't want to wait. They felt like they were being made to look foolish and ineffective. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today. In part 4, we're going to talk about the actual siege, the day the music died, if you will, and we're going to talk about what happened, and we're going to talk about the legal battles that followed, and we're going to talk a little bit about where the Branch Davidians are today, and if they still believe in their prophet, and how they're feeling, and what's going on with the land at Mount Carmel. We're going to talk a little bit about that too. So we're definitely going to wrap up this series in our next video. And then I have a lot of cool things planned for you guys. So once I'm out of heavy research mode for this video, I will be able to kind of put out more videos because they don't have to be weeks and weeks. I mean, this has been a month and a half of research for this series, so I'm not going to need to put as much research into those other videos. It's just these cult series. This is why I don't do them that often, because it's impossible for me to leave anything on the table. It's impossible for me to feel that there's not every detail that's important or needs to be told when I'm telling the story. And that's why I don't do them every month. I used to do them every month, and they were just so time consuming, and then you guys didn't get any other videos except for the cult series, and I felt bad. So I probably won't do a cult series every month, maybe once every 3 months, but I do have another serial killers series coming up, and we have so many cool things coming. Thank you guys so much for being here. Stay kind and stay beautiful. Check out Magellan TV in the description box. They're an amazing sponsor, and we are very appreciative for them here. Have a great day. I will see you next time. Bye.
bottles going straight down.